You're listening to Uncovering Dark Falls, and I already know what you're thinking. Gideon, where have you been? Are you okay? Why haven't you uploaded? And my answer to all of those questions are busy, yes, and I've actually been interviewing for jobs. Now, when I first moved to Dark Falls, it wasn't, believe it or not, to investigate mysteries, that's happened in this weird town. That's not why I moved here. I have been depleting a big part of my savings, so I am looking for work right now. I'm trying to get hired somewhere. And over the last several weeks, I've had multiple rounds of interviews for different positions at different jobs and stuff, man. And you know what? It's so annoying. I didn't get any single one of them, but I did get 3 interviews deep into a couple of different positions. And let me just say, if you run a company and it takes you 3 interviews over the course of 3 to 4 weeks to decide if you want to hire somebody, don't do that. Just be faster. All right. Anyway, that's my little nitpick thing. And again, thank you for your worry. I'm good. In the middle of all that nonsense, I did do some more research on an old summer camp. And let me tell you about it now. It was a grueling 6-hour drive, as my location sat at the very edge of Dark Falls, but I'd finally arrived. Distant memories of my parents dropping me off at camp when I was 10 flooded my mind as I took in the familiar scene of the old abandoned camp that stood before me. The old sign at the camp's entrance was missing a few letters. Now it just said Camp Cole Lay. But during its heyday, when these cabins were bustling with kids and before the letters were lost to time, the camp's sign used to actually read Camp Cold Lake. I scanned the dilapidated buildings carefully as I made my way through the camp, and it wasn't long before I found what I was looking for. The building sat right in the middle of the camp, and it was the largest cabin there. I made my way to the main office of the camp's former head counselor, and I broke down the large, termite-riddled wooden door. As I rummaged through all of the drawers, looking for the files that I'd driven all the way out here to find, I wondered if finding these particular documents was really worth risking a criminal trespassing charge. Even though I'd assumed the camp was abandoned, there was still a part of me that just knew the owner of these cabins still might be out there somewhere. If I was right about all of this, it meant that not only was I breaking and entering into an abandoned camp, but I was also stealing documents, all of which fall under third-degree burglary and can lead to multiple years in prison. I knew, though, without a doubt, that I couldn't survive 30 minutes in jail, let alone 7 years. Dude, I'm not cut out for it. But I'd been obsessing over this case for months now, and the files lying dormant somewhere in this abandoned cabin had all of the answers that I had been desperately searching for, as the details written in these documents were extremely key to solving a disturbing mystery that happened at this very camp about 44 years ago during the summer of 1981. So, I did what I knew I had to do. I steeled my resolve. I nutted up or shut it up, as some might say, and I kept searching through the rusty cabinets. I tried to speed things up because I didn't want to be found snooping if the owner or the groundskeeper or whoever decided to pop in for a routine check of the camp. It would be my luck, they might come by once a week just to make sure that nothing's burned down or whatever, and they would find me there. But even if I was caught, and I had to spend 7 years behind bars, I told myself there was a silver lining, because I would finally have all of the time to focus on getting my dream gym bod that I'd always wanted. Plus, I'd finally be able to get some reading done, and I might even finish Charlotte's Web, which was a book that I never finished in the 3rd grade. This was mostly because I always slept through Mrs. Smith's boring English class, and it was hard to keep my eyes open whenever she started speaking. Now, don't get me wrong, right? While the idea of spending my days lifting weights in the yard and reading sounded great, I was also aware of the downsides, like, for example, getting stabbed in my sleep for looking at an inmate wrong, or becoming somebody's girlfriend, who knows. But I just had to take the good with the bad, and I'd already decided that it was a risk that I was willing to take if it meant getting to the bottom of this case. Most of the camp records and the documents had been ravaged by rats, so I knew the owner wouldn't miss the files that I came to retrieve, as it was pretty much all fair game at this point. I spent an hour sifting through these files before I finally came across hers. It was sitting at the base of a locked, rusted metal drawer. I had to break the old padlock to get access, and I guess luckily for me, her documents were all still intact. Now, I'm sure that you're all wondering what documents could have been so important that I broke federal law and risked prison time to get them. And to be honest, most of these documents were just worthless records of the kids who spent their summers at this camp over the years. But there was one particular file that was worth everything to this investigation. And that file belonged to a 12-year-old girl named Sarah Maas. Over the course of my investigation, I had discovered that Camp Cold Lake's head counselor, which was a dude named Richard, who oversaw the camp during the summer of '81, he kept detailed, well, let's call them camper evaluations, which were files that were very similar to school records on every camper. Most of these docs held registration and medical forms for each child, but the files that I was most interested in were the incident reports that contained detailed behavior and adjustment notes, in addition to disciplinary reports on problem campers or socially awkward kids who had trouble fitting in with others. These files also held private communication logs, in addition to handwritten counselor notes on the kids who had issues adjusting to camp life. Richard had penned several detailed notes on Sarah that revealed her behavioral, social, and emotional struggles over the course of that summer. These notes contained all of the notable incidents that held the truth behind this investigation that I was currently obsessed over, because they painted a full picture of the events that took place at Camp Cold Lake all those years ago. Now, Camp Cold Lake's head counselor, Richard, wrote his first detailed note in Sarah's file on the 9th of August of 1981, and the note said, quote, "It's only been a day since Sarah Maas arrived, and she's the first camper who's already visited my office to complain. Sarah barges in, complaining about how her bunkmates, Meg, Janice, and Brianna, had all chosen the best beds, leaving her the worst one. I could tell she was finding it really difficult after her parents had unwittingly signed her up to spend her summer at Camp Cold Lake for the very first time. She told me that while her brother Aaron was excited to spend his summer at the camp, she, on the other hand, wasn't a fan of swimming or the other water-based activities that our camp offered. She also mentioned that the idea of going to camp never really resonated with her because, she'd much rather be curled up under her blanket at home than be a walking, snack for the mosquitoes that would often visit the campers at night. To make her first day a bit easier, I decided to indulge her complaints, so I went to her room and I asked one of her roommates, Brianna, to switch beds with Sarah. Now, I could tell that my decision annoyed Brianna because she gave Sarah this sinister look, but I needed them to be considerate since this was Sarah's first time here, and the first night was usually the hardest for new campers. I'd hoped that they'd all had been able to move on from this little conflict and become good friends, but unfortunately, things only got worse from there. Sarah came to my office again that night, telling me how her bunkmates had pulled a prank that led the other campers to make fun of her. Sarah told me that the prank was revenge after she'd accidentally knocked over Jan's backpack and spilled her asthma inhalers, revealing to everybody in the camp that she was asthmatic. Something that she hadn't wanted everybody to know, I suppose. Sarah had also made some seemingly innocent comments about Meg's weight and height, which made Meg mad. I'd assumed this had been related to the bed issue, but after her first day at camp, I realized that Sarah was a socially awkward kid who found it difficult to make friends. She sometimes came off as rude or clumsy, needy, annoying even if she didn't mean to. Sarah then told me about the prank, saying that it happened after all the campers had gathered around the campfire. Brianna and Meg told her that a camper had tossed some fireworks into the fire, so she got up screaming as she ran from the flames and the loud noises. It wasn't long before she realized it was a lie, but it was already too late. The other campers had started to mock and tease her. It was a hard first day for Sarah Moss, and I could tell the anxious and the insecure girl that was sitting in my office wanted nothing more than to go home. So I tried to cheer her up by telling her that while the early days were the hardest, things would get much better once she made a friend that she could spend her time with. I assured her that her person was still out there, and that once she found them, they'd both create great memories of Camp Cold Lake, just like I did, when I was her age. I promised her that the time that she spent at camp would eventually turn into amazing memories that she'd never forget. End quote. Now, as I read through Richard's first note on Sarah Moss, I began to recall my own first day at camp. I was a little nervous at first, naturally, but I think I quickly settled in. That very same night, I'd snuck out with a few boys to go swimming in the freezing lake, which, now that I think about it, was how I first found out that freezing cold water does, what it does to my nether regions. Aside from the impromptu biology lesson, I met some of my best friends that night, and I'd always looked forward to going back to camp to see them again. I guess it's different with girls, as they rarely did anything crazy and were constantly monitored by camp counselors, but if what I uncovered during my investigation was true, then that means that Sarah's time at Camp Cold Lake was about to get a lot more insane. The second camper evaluation note in Sarah's file was written just a week later, right, on August 16th of 1981, about 10 o'clock at night. And Richard shared his thoughts on the week that had passed, writing this, quote, "Things with Sarah reached a new low today. I never imagined that it would come to this, but over the week, Sarah, along with her bunkmates, Brianna, Meg, and Jan, had started World War III in their little cabin at Camp Cold Lake. It all started when one of our camp counselors, Liz, told the campers all the rules that they needed to know while staying at Camp Cold Lake. She then revealed the most important rule of our camp, and that is the buddy system rule, which emphasized that no camper could go out into the lake or enter the water without a buddy. After Liz finished listing out all of the rules, I stepped in to make some additional announcements before telling some tried and true camp jokes that I hoped would put everybody in a good mood. However, it appears that my jokes didn't lift anybody's spirits, because just a few minutes after I had addressed the camp, Meg and Brianna tossed a snake that they'd found into Sarah's shirt. I tried to step in, but Sarah quickly fished the snake out of her shirt before throwing it away and leaving the campfire. It wasn't long after that before I received another report from the girls' cabin. Meg and Brianna's beds were riddled with spiders. Both girls were badly bitten when they lay down to sleep, and it wasn't hard to figure out who the culprit was. It was pretty clear to everybody that this was Sarah's revenge, but there wasn't any proof until Jan confirmed it, saying that she had seen Sarah putting the spiders there earlier. Meg and Brianna were then rushed to the infirmary while I tried to bring some order to their chaotic cabin. But despite my efforts, this brutal war between these four 12-year-old girls continued the very next day. Apparently, Sarah wanted to go canoeing, but due to the buddy system rule, she needed a partner before she could take out a canoe to the lake. I was then informed that Sarah had asked Jan to go canoeing with her, but Jan, who was still salty that Sarah had revealed her asthmatic condition to the entire camp, told her no. Sarah did not take no for an answer though, because she really wanted to go canoeing, so she reported Jan to Counselor Liz, who coerced Jan into going with her anyway. As expected, the canoeing trip ended in pure chaos, and both girls came back with two different stories. Now, the Jan side of things, Jan swore that Sarah had deliberately knocked over their canoe while they were out on the lake to tip her over, which was the reason that she had to swim back to shore. Liz had to go help Sarah, who was having difficulty controlling the canoe by herself. Now, on the other side of things, the Sarah side of the story, She insists that Jan jumped into the water herself to get revenge because Jan found out that she couldn't go on the upcoming 6-day canoeing trip after Sarah had revealed to the camp that she has asthma. The girls were reaching unseen levels of pettiness now, so Liz and I decided to gather everyone around the campfire that night before giving an extremely lengthy and very serious lecture on the importance of water safety rules. None of the campers wanted to be there, and I could tell they all blamed Sarah for having to listen to the lecture, which led them to stigmatize her even more. I had made plans to handle the tense situation, but this morning, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands and escalated the situation to a whole other level. I was told Liz had to pull Sarah out of the lake and resuscitate her after she'd gone under the water. Sarah claimed her drowning was an accident, but after being a counselor for this long, I knew when a child was lying, and I could tell this was all a show that she'd put on to get some sympathy from the other campers. I was ready to give her another lengthy lecture, in addition to getting her parents on the phone, but I hesitated because of the disturbing look in Sarah's eyes. Now, while I wasn't completely sure, I could tell Sarah's whole body language had changed, and she really looked like she'd seen something truly terrifying when she went under the water. I decided to ask around, and a few campers had mentioned how Sarah had revealed this truly disturbing story explaining what happened after she'd nearly drowned in the lake. There were a few minor differences in, the various recollections that I had heard and gathered from the other campers about what happened, but at least according to Sarah's own words, she says, "Before camp counselor Liz pulled me out of the water and the world around me came back into view, I went somewhere. This place looked exactly like the camp, just a little bit different. It was cold, and I couldn't believe my eyes because snow was falling all around me in the middle of the summer, and the trees were barren because they had all their leaves gone. I had come out of the freezing lake, but I couldn't see anybody in sight. I called out to the counselors and the other campers, but nobody responded. I wandered around alone until I heard an eerie, distant sound of what sounded like somebody singing. I traced the voice until I came across a very pale girl. She looked me in the eyes, and she said her name was Della. She then told me that she'd been waiting for me for a long time. Now, the eerie silence in the camp was deafening now, as the lack of noise from the other campers was unsettling. It was at this point that Della asked if I would like to be her buddy so that we could go do some camp activities together. But before I could even respond, I noticed something bizarre. Her feet were hovering off the ground now, and her skin had gone from this pale color to translucent as I started to see right through her. Words can't explain how horrified I felt as she began to levitate and the trees behind her torso came into full view. Her lips were blue, and her fingers were blue, and I could tell that Della was a camper who had drowned, and the only reason that I could see her was because, well, I was drowning too. So I refused to be her buddy, and I ran as fast as my legs could carry me. It wasn't long after that before the world around me started to go dark, and I awoke to Liz's worried face after she had rescued me. And that's the end of Sarah's statement. Now, I'd never personally confirmed this story with Sarah, as, I initially felt it was all ludicrous, to be honest. So I took the third-hand recollections from other campers who claimed that these were Sarah's own words with a grain of salt. However, over the following days, Sarah had some puzzling incidents that started to make me believe that there might be some truth to that crazy story. We had a camp meeting later that night, and while Sarah was looking for a seat, she suddenly begins to scream at the top of her lungs that she could see a girl named Della. All the counselors rushed to her side to check if she was okay and to confirm what or who she was seeing that made her so scared. However, we couldn't see or locate this Della girl who frightened Sarah and left her visibly shaken. We all assumed that Sarah was experiencing some form of post-traumatic stress, which would likely explain her hallucinations. The only good thing that did come out of this was that Sarah's plan for sympathy worked, because for the first time since the start of the summer, her bunkmates Jan, Meg, and Brianna had gathered around her to apologize, sincerely. I was even told that they'd spent hours together having fun and talking well into the night. There were still a few other campers who'd now branded Sarah as the weird kid or whatever, but overall, everyone felt sorry for her, and I hope that we could finally put this whole ordeal behind us. End quote. That was a big recollection of notes. Thank you for sticking around with me while I read through all of that. Now, if you ask me, Gideon, I felt bad for Sarah as I finished head counselor Richard's second note. Despite my own experience, I knew that making friends at camp was hard, and kids can and will be cruel. From what I'd read so far, Sarah didn't strike me as the weird camper kid who'd make up something as bizarre as seeing some dead girl named Della. Looking back on my own time at camp, our resident weird camper was a kid named, what was it? Billy. His name was Billy, and he did things like drawing faces on rocks before he would make out with them, right? And he would regularly pray to his Pokemon cards. In addition to stealing and wearing everyone else's underwear, the kid just got weirder and weirder the more time went on. Now, while I wasn't sure what exactly was going on with Sarah, I really did believe that Sarah was actually seeing something, and it wasn't just the shock or the trauma like the counselor said that it was. This crazy town of Dark Falls has proven time and time again that there was always some truth in the strange. That's why I found it really depressing when some kids had branded Sarah as the weird kid, because she really didn't seem like the type to wake everyone up in the cabin at 12:30 in the morning like Billy did all of those years ago to tell us that he'd started a new religion before forcing us to bow down to his Pikachu plushie. I shouldn't be laughing at Billy, but I can't help it, man. That shit's hilarious. I sometimes wonder where Billy is now, actually, and if he ever did start his own Pokemon church. I'd spent a few minutes reminiscing about my own weird camper kid and camp days before I decided to read the third and final note left by Richard on Sarah Moss. Richard wrote down his thoughts on the 23rd of August, 1981 at exactly 4:34 a.m., and he started his last note with the sentence, quote, "I haven't slept in 3 days because of Sarah Moss. I never thought that her summer camp trip would end like this, yet here we are. It all began after that night when I thought everything would go back to normal, but Sarah's new episodes continued the very next day when she went swimming with Counselor Liz and some of the other campers. Sarah claimed to have seen Della in the water and on the boat, saying that Della had vanished into thin air before anyone could see her. This new behavior left Counselor Liz very worried, and rightfully so, so she brought Sarah to my office and asked her to speak with me. The very first question that Sarah Moss asked me was if there was a record of a camper who drowned in the past at Camp Cold Lake. Now, at first, I did not want to entertain these fairy tales with her, but I decided to tell her the truth as I hoped it'd bring some peace to her mind. So I told her, no, there's never been a camper that's drowned because we'd always taken the water safety rules very seriously here. All of a sudden, Sarah had this terrified look on her face because she told me that Della was now standing right behind me. But, of course, when I turned around, nobody was there. I'd grown sick and tired of this ghost gimmick, but again, I could tell that the little girl sitting in front of me was genuinely frightened by something, so I urged her to focus on camp sports, hoping that would help her forget the supposed ghost girl that had been, following her around and terrifying her. Sarah did take my advice, and she went water skiing with Counselor Liz. However, after Liz had taught her how to water ski, Sarah claimed that she saw the ghost girl Della driving the boat that was pulling her along the water. And, of course, no explanation was given, as to how this seemingly incorporeal ghost girl that Sarah could somehow perceive had managed to take hold of and steer the boat's physical controls, right? Whatever. But none of these logical questions were going through this child's mind because Sarah let go of the line that connected her to the boat out of fear, and she once again falls into the lake where she began to drown. Luckily, her life jacket kept her afloat for some time, but Sarah then claimed again that Della turned the boat around and tried to run her down. The ghost girl was only able to rip through her life jacket before Sarah escaped to shore. I now didn't know what to believe. There was a rip in Sarah's life jacket, for sure, I could see it, but her story was way too far-fetched for me to even consider. It was clear to me that the camp life did not suit Sarah Moss, and I was about to call her parents so that they could come get her, but I don't know, man, something in me just didn't do that, so I decided to talk to her one last time in order to really try to clear some things up. When I arrived to the girls' cabin, I was told by her present bunkmates that Sarah had come back to their room, changed out of her wet clothes, and then told everyone that she was leaving. Her bunkmate, Brianna, had apparently tried to stop her, but after seeing how determined she was, Brianna could pretty much only wish her good luck at that point as she watched Sarah run off into the woods. Now, after hearing this, I immediately darted off into the woods after her as she was all alone and I didn't want her to get hurt. And it took about 30 minutes of searching, but by the time I found her, Sarah was having a full-blown conversation with, the wind. There was no one standing in front of her, but Sarah, who was clearly seeing something that wasn't there, called this unseen apparition Della. This was the same name of the ghost girl that had supposedly been tormenting her, and while I couldn't make out all of their conversation, from what I could hear, it appeared that Della had told Sarah that she did not drown in the lake. Now, again, this conversation was completely one-sided, as it seemed like Sarah was just speaking to herself, but judging from what I could hear Sarah responding with, it appeared that the ghost girl Della had died after she'd wandered into the woods by herself one night and was bitten by a deadly snake. Della apparently wanted Sarah to believe that she drowned so she could get as far away from the lake as possible and then lure her into the woods where she could die from a snake bite. This was apparently Della's master plan, so that Sarah could just die like she did and then become her buddy forever. I didn't know if Sarah, was having some form of psychosis as she started screaming that a snake was coiling around her leg. I couldn't see if she was telling the truth from where I was standing, and I didn't know if revealing myself would send her into shock even more or push her into an even worse state. Even though I wasn't sure what was happening to this little girl, or if my presence would traumatize her even more, I decided to go and help her. But before I could reveal myself, Brianna came out of the shadows and she pulled a coiled snake off of Sarah's leg before it could bite her. I started running towards the girls so I could get them out of there when the forest suddenly went cold. My legs felt heavy and I could feel myself slowing down. I could hear Brianna, who could apparently also see the ghost girl Della as well, telling Sarah that Della had tried to kill her last summer, so she made it her mission to defend and protect new campers from falling into Della's trap. The girls then hugged each other, and I could hear a faint wail of agony in the wind, and judging from their reactions, it seemed that Della had vanished after she'd finally been defeated. Counselor Richard goes on to write, "I know I'm going to sound crazy, but the details of what I saw next are still hard for me to believe. If I'm recalling what I saw correctly, Sarah tried to embrace Brianna, but her hands went right through Brianna's body. I blinked, thinking that my mind was just playing tricks on me, but the forest went dead silent as Brianna revealed that the ghost girl Della that they could both see had actually killed her last summer. But even after the death, Brianna didn't want to be Della's buddy, so she came back to make her own. And with a sinister grin on her face, Brianna started walking towards Sarah, holding the same snake in her hand that she'd pulled off Sarah's leg just a moment ago. Brianna then calmly asked Sarah if she could be her buddy forever before attacking her with a snake. Both girls then tumbled out of my view, and within seconds, they were gone. My mind couldn't fully comprehend what I'd just seen, and I nearly began hyperventilating. However, I pulled myself together as I knew there was no time to waste, so I immediately called all the counselors to do a thorough search of the forest, but we were never able to find the girls. 3 days have passed now, and despite our endless searching, Sarah and Brianna are still missing. Both the authorities and Sarah's parents have been informed, but I fear it's too late now, because their bodies have not been found, and it's safe to assume the worst. Who would have thought that at the end of the summer, Sarah would turn into the very same thing that she feared, as she's now become a ghost of Camp Cold Lake. End quote. That was the last handwritten note that was penned by head counselor Richard before he was fired the very next month. My investigation showed that both the parents and his superiors at the camp believed the two girls went missing as a result of his negligence, so he was let go from his role. I tried to look into the history of Camp Cold Lake, but that proved to be difficult because it's one of the oldest camps in Dark Falls, dating all the way back to the 20s, come to find out, and any records on the camp's inception were very few and far between. However, after some more, let's call it extensive research, I was able to uncover that a girl named Della Thompson did go to Camp Cold Lake in 1953. Now, I wasn't able to find out what actually happened to her that summer or if she'd really died in the woods, as records there were sparse. But, here's the kicker. When I looked into Sarah's bunkmate, Brianna, I came across an obituary for a 13-year-old girl named Brianna Williams. The obituary was listed on the 19th of August in 1980, which was a whole year before several campers had seen her at Camp Cold Lake during the summer of 1981. Now, don't get me wrong. I wasn't completely sure that it was the same Brianna. It could have been another kid with the same name who died, but Brianna's last name on her camp file was also Williams. And I just felt it was necessary to point out that coincidence, if that's really what it was. As far as Sarah Moss, she was filed as a missing child on the 31st of August, and judging from my research, it seemed that she was never found. I'd finally put all the pieces together, and my investigation into Cold Camp Lake was over. As I stared out into the cold, dark lake that I could still see in the distance, I thought about reliving some old memories and going for a dip, but I don't know. I wasn't exactly enthusiastic about the idea of becoming buddies with this clingy ghost girl named Della. So, I just got back into my car and I drove home, because my next case was already waiting for me on my desk. Hey, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Uncovering Dark Falls. It's truly appreciated. You're here, you're listening to this. You are officially a real one. You are a resident of Dark Falls. Nice to meet you, neighbor. Hey, couple things. Somebody asked me, what's the best way to support the channel? I don't want to do the $5 Patreon. I don't do a lot of social media, whatever. How can I best, show support and help the channel grow or the show grow? And the answer is pretty simple. Watch another one right now. If you watch 2 full episodes back to back, that does crazy things for the podcast algorithm and for the YouTube algorithm. And they're both so helpful. So if that's your jam, I invite you to watch another one now. You're the best. Thank you.
Uncovering Dark Falls is written by David Caleb and Dr. Plague. Created, produced, and narrated by Derek Weber.